Hi everyone. As everyone's making their way in to our virtual room, just want to say hi. Yeah, good to see a lot of familiar faces. Yeah, if you feel comfortable, please go ahead and put your name and your organization in the chat. Say hi to each other. Uh, Zoe, is that everyone from the waiting room in?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, well, everyone lives very busy lives, so we'll just go ahead and start. Thank you all for availing your time. We know it's a busy period for everybody. Some of us are preparing for the UN Ocean Conference. Some of us are preparing for the climate meetings in Bonn. And we just want to say thank you for making time to attend. Welcome to the fourth session of our Lessons Learned webinar series hosted by the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Before we dive in, just some quick housekeeping. We do have we have live translation in Spanish and French. You can select your preferred language channel by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting the little universe icon. Just a little bit about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. The objective of this lesson learned series is that in order to launch the negotiation that we hope will happen to really bring an end to the era of fossil fuels, it's important that we learn lessons from those processes, those treaties, and those people who've come before us. So we've had a couple of sessions so far. They are all available on the website. And Liz or Zoe, if you're so kind, if you can plug those in the chat, which have been really insightful and opened up the door for conversations about how much it really took for civil society actors in particular to organize themselves and coordinate with governments. The lessons learned about the importance of relationships and the lessons learned about really staying the course when the conversations are quite difficult and are very long. One of the other important lessons that's really coming out for us is, of course, the real need to hold those most impacted at the front of the conversations. So we are very, very pleased to have this series going and to have the benefit of experts and civil society actors who were really crucial in those processes, and to be able to learn from them and have really open and frank conversations with them through this Lessons Learned webinar series. Just another note for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, we will be hosting a virtual summit on the 8th to the 15th of September. You can find more information on our website. We believe specific times will be confirmed in due course. And we do have a registration link, which we can share. Yeah, which Zoe, I think, is sharing in the chat already. So today, in our fourth of our Lessons Learned webinar series, we explore one of the most iconic and impactful disarmament campaigns of our time. It is the international movement to ban landmines and the creation of the Mine Ban Treaty. I'd like to introduce our esteemed speakers. We have Mary Wareham. She is Deputy Director at the Human Rights Watch Crisis and Conflict Division, where she leads the ARMS program. A longtime advocate for humanitarian disarmament, she played a key role in the international campaign to ban landmines and is co-laureate of the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize, and helped establish the Landmine Monitor to track treaty implementation. Her work has been central to advancing international treaties that protect civilians from weapons of war. Our second speaker is Jill Sinclair, a senior Canadian expert in defense and international security, widely recognized for her leadership in the Ottawa process to ban landmines. With extensive experience across NATO, NORAD, and the UN, she has also advised the Ukraine on military reform. Her global contributions have earned her Ukraine's Order of Merit, underscoring her impact on peace and diplomacy. So Mary and Jill are on the call, and we're very, very honored to have you join us and to kind of share your experience. To give everyone a overview of how we'll do this, we'll ask a couple of opening questions to Mary and Jill to kind of set the scene and give everyone the same understanding of where we are and where we came from for the Mine Ban Treaty. And then we'll open up for Q&A. We want to really focus on the Q&A section, so please have your questions ready. So, without further ado, let's go to Mary first. Mary, can you give us a little bit more? Can you tell us what the political context was like when you started working on the Mine Ban initiative? You know, we note that this started all the way back in 1992, but negotiations only launched in 1997. From your perspective as a civil society actor, what was the political context you operated in? And can you tell us about how you went about like bringing groups together to really start this conversation? Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Gemma, and kia ora, everybody. And I just want to acknowledge Liz Bernstein here, who I worked very much alongside with on the international campaign to ban landmines. My organization, Human Rights Watch, is currently comprised of more than 500 staff, but back in the late 1980s, there were only a couple of dozen. And that was a time at which we were documenting human rights abuses, as we do today. And that's when the work started for us on this issue. Researchers started to, when they were visiting hospitals, started to realize that many of the patients in the hospitals were victims of anti-personnel landmines. So our first report was on the landmine problem in Nicaragua and El Salvador in the mid-1980s. And then we continued to find more victims of landmines in Cambodia, in Mozambique, in Angola, and realized that this was not just a country-specific problem, but a worldwide problem. And as we were putting those reports together, we were also looking at the advocacy and what we could do about this. And we identified a complete prohibition as being the most effective way to stem the civilian harm from anti-personnel landmines. And to create a framework for dealing with this. There was already a piece of international law that attempted to regulate the use of anti-personnel landmines, but it had been widely ignored by many fighting forces. And that's why we had this widespread problem today. Also, the realization that you cannot really control anti-personnel landmines once they are laid, and it's not really possible to say if you fence and mark and map, you'll be able to exclude civilians. They were just not weapons that could be used in that way. So after we'd been doing this reporting for a couple of years, it had put us in touch with other organizations who were working on victim assistance, disability, rights of people with disabilities, especially in countries that were emerging from the Cold War. And there was also the beginning of mine clearance programs starting in Afghanistan and then swiftly moving to Angola, Mozambique, and the Balkans. And into Latin America and Central America. And so for us, it was important as we documented this trend to also look at what we could do about it. And we realized that the complete prohibition is what was needed, but we knew that we couldn't deliver on that alone. So we invited 6 of the organizations to come to our offices in New York in October 1992 to talk about this shared problem. And the end result of that meeting was that it was the foundational meeting of the campaign to ban landmines. We agreed to form a coordinated civil society initiative to work for a complete prohibition on anti-personnel landmines. So that means not just prohibit the use, but also address the development, production, stockpiling, acquisition, and transfers of anti-personnel landmines. And we didn't realize it at the time, but we were able to, in the treaty negotiations, also achieve some remedial measures, some humanitarian provisions to also address the humanitarian consequences. So maybe that's just my little snapshot of starting off. And I guess, well, you were asking about the political context, was that this was very new. for any government. They were very used to talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. They had just, they were in the throes of negotiating the Chemical Weapons Convention. We also had the Biological Weapons Convention, and these are conventions that are disarmament treaties, but also have some types of humanitarian rationale for their basis. But I was at school at the time in New Zealand studying these weapons of mass destruction, and I read an article about the landmine campaign, and I didn't realize it at the time until I read it, that that anti-personnel landmines were taking more lives and limbs than those three weapons of mass destruction combined, nuclear, biological, and chemical. When I asked my professor why wasn't I learning about this in my class, he gave me that answer: it's too new. This is all evolving at the moment. And so he suggested that I should study chemical weapons, and I went the other way and studied landmines and said I take that as a challenge. If this is unstudied and unreported and not being talked about, I want to be one of the people who does that, who talks about that. So that's my kind of. So Human Rights Watch, together with these other organizations, formed the coalition, articulating the goal of the treaty. And we set about kind of explaining the problem in the early years. So that was done throughout country reporting, which then was rolled into a kind of an omnibus global report called Landmines: A Deadly Legacy. And that became one of the kind of founding reference documents, not just for civil society, but for, I think, for governments as well. I might use that point to then hand it over to Jill to talk about how the governments got involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that. And yes, that's a perfect segue to what we'd like Jill to speak about. So Jill, as I understand, you had a lot of involvement with coordinating governments for this process. Mary spoke about how the novelty of the process and perhaps kind of the inherent pushback that came with that. Can you speak about the role that you played, your experience with working with countries and how important it was to hold them together, and perhaps some of the work that you kind of did to bring them along to a novel process? Thank you so much, Jill.
Well, thanks. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation aujourd'hui. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And Mary, I'd like to key off a couple of things that Mary said because they were so important. And I just want to reinforce them a little bit in terms of getting to the question that you posed to me, Gemma. Political context, massively important. And I have to say that the political context in which we worked, and so lessons learned are only relevant if you kind of try to situate it in the current context too. We had a very permissive political environment in a way, and it's hard to think that way, Mary, now knowing what we went through at the time, but it was a lot more predictable. It was a lot more permissive. It was a lot more hopeful. And so as you think about whatever issues you're working on today, the context is important. It shouldn't stultify and terrify you into inaction, but being ready with the product for the right political moment is extremely important. And what Mary described, the way that civil society through the human rights lens had become aware of this issue years before governments focused on it, all the advocacy, all the coordination, all the work that was already done, so that when governments finally kind of woke up and said, yeah, this is an issue, maybe we should act, you had partners, you had a process, you had a fact base, you had everything that you could drive forward. I just like to say how important that was. The tip of the iceberg is always interesting, but it's what goes on underneath, which all of you know so well. But what Mary's spoken about is that extraordinary work that was done by civil society. The other thing, and I mentioned it in passing, is, Mary again talked about how it was Human Rights Watch. Well, as a government person, and my background's all in arms control and disarmament and international security, I was sitting at arms control tables discussing the landmines issue. And it was the epiphany that civil society had, which governments came to in the late 1990s, that said, you know what, this isn't just a military issue, this is a humanitarian issue. And so that reframing, this is a message, reframe the issue in a way that resonates differently, look at it through a different lens. For years and years and years, we had looked at landmines through the Conference on Disarmament and through an arms control lens. And that got you some of the way, but it didn't get you all the way, because what we needed to do was to establish a new norm against these weapons and to make the case that, in fact, the military utility, we were not saying there was no military utility. We were just saying that that was massively outweighed by the humanitarian consequences. And so figuring out how to reframe and put a lens around things, and this was extremely, extremely important. And then having that civil society group for governments to talk to. And by the time that governments, when I came in to lead the Ottawa process that led to the Ottawa Treaty, we had the ICBL that had already grouped together the 6 key organizations. So it made it so easy to be able to develop a partnership with civil society, because we had a place to dock. We had one dock which we knew had legitimacy with the civil society community globally, not just in one country, but around the world, and from the point of view of those who are most affected by these weapons. So many different things in the context. And I have to say that made it, I'm going to say easy, but it sure made it easier to run a government process, to inspire other governments to come along and to say, look, there's a logic behind the need for this treaty. There's an urgency behind the need for this treaty. As you know, governments don't come easily to dramatic action usually. But on this one, the compelling evidence was there. The voices of society were there. So social license was there for governments around the world. And this was an issue that resonated at both a human level and a political level. And so when I was privileged and lucky to be sitting as the director of the Arms Control Division, and I was asked by an extraordinary foreign minister who we had, Lloyd Axworthy, who had masses of vision and tons of political courage, which are also very important in any action that you want to take internationally. When he said, take this and run with it, I then reached out to a bunch of countries, and I established a little core group of countries. And I had Norway, and I had Austria. There's a little bit of feedback. Is it me, or is that better? Good. Yeah, good. Had South Africa, we had Mexico. I put together a group of about 8 countries that represented sort of globally the issue. And we worked in the most intimate, coordinated, choreographed way to exploit every political opportunity in the year between the Ottawa conference, when Lloyd Axworthy made the challenge to the world to come back in a year to sign a treaty that would have been negotiated, to make sure that we reached out to civil society, to politicians, to all actors across the world, using this core group of countries, which was mobilized, was passionate, and had committed early on in their own national legislation to doing the right things around landmines. So I think I'll stop there, because I've given you a lot of things. I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question, but look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jill. No, you gave us plenty to think about. I think some of what you said around, all the work that kind of came out in the political context is really based on is the tip of the iceberg. There's a long history of work that the civil society side did, and that's also important to talk about, which, Mary, thank you for touching on that. You also mentioned the role of, a small but strong group of core countries to champion the process led by a particular Lloyd Axworthy. There's so many parallels between what you're saying and what we're seeing right now with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I want to also take this time to acknowledge that we have on the call with us Alex Rafalowicz, who's our executive director, and Sephora Berman, who is our co-chair, leaders of the process. And Alex, Sep, maybe I do want to take some moderator's privilege and pass over to you to speak very briefly, because we want to hear mostly from Mary and Jill about maybe just touching on some of these political points. And for this group here, who may not all be from FFNPT, kind of drawing some parallels that we can use to kick off the conversation Alex, Sep, please.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you, Mary and Jill, for your time and for your all the work that you did on that pivotal piece of international law. It was really inspiring hearing some of those reflections. I think they've been part of our North Stars in lots of ways in approaching this problem. So we've certainly seen that there's a chance for civil society to kind of start the conversation and to push it out there and to look for ways of reframing it. So, of course, the challenge of fossil fuels is a huge risk to the climate system, but fossil fuels also are a humanitarian law risk. They're a risk to Indigenous people's rights. They're a risk to human health. They're a risk, all along their production chain. And so we've been trying to think about how do we also articulate that risk and how do we do the work of that fine balance, I think possibly that Jill then stepped into, of generating ideas and materials and political space that countries, as they recognize, governments as they recognize the need to address this, can then pick up without it being too constraining for them, but also to give them a strong framework for action. So it was really appreciated your time and your reflections, and great to see so many other people on the call as well, interested in what we can learn here. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Alex. So Mary and Jill, I cannot see the chat, but I'm just wondering if there's any questions from the audience. Some of what you said around forming the core group. Right now, we have a group of 16 countries who have endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, small but mighty, and there are ministers among them who've heavily championed the cause. So maybe Mary and Jill, I would like to ask both of you, Mary, what was your experience maybe on the other side of that process, looking into the countries and how they worked, how they behaved? And Jill, what was your experience feeding information, technical expertise, reports and materials to governments, and how did you really socialize it with them? I think that those are two sides of the coin that are really important for us as we progress this work.
Okay. Well, I could maybe just hop in and say, I think we've kind of touched on, the civil society groups as providing the evidence base and providing the coordination to speak with one voice when push comes to shove, but also always along the way demonstrating the diversity of who you have on board. There are two other kind of key stakeholders who have been involved not only in the landmine treaty process, but other processes. One are UN agencies, and it's always helpful to have a lead UN agency. And I would say that UNICEF was the lead agency for us on the landmine treaty, although others were helping at that time. And then the International Committee of the Red Cross. They're the kind of ones that governments look to for advice as to whether there is a legal gap and whether the law needs to be strengthened. So those were absolutely key for us. I think it's really important as you're explaining the problem to everybody to always have the solution when you talk about it. So I was just at a meeting last week and we were talking about the legal, the humanitarian, the ethical implications of another weapon, killer robots, autonomous weapon systems. But as we explained all of these problems, we would say, and therefore we need the legally binding instrument. This is the framework that will help us to address these concerns. So whenever you talk about the problem, always uplifting what the answer is. And providing that in a kind of positive way of something for people to rally around, because people don't rally around a problem, right? They rally around the solution. And that's what the positive framing is so important for. And I know that that's a big thing for you. We had strategies for the different countries. We uplifted the champions. You have the 16 countries, and there are many of those who are directly impacted by fossil fuels and of the proliferation of them. And I would say that was kind of a key thing for landmines as well, to have Cambodia, to have other mine affected countries in there at the center, and to be placing victims at the center, and to be, being extremely taking great care with how you work with those champion states, because they can be small and fragile with limited resources, but you really want to uplift them. You also want to bring along the global majority of countries, right? And try and get your numbers up. And that's been kind of where you get the bulk of the signatories from, is if you can bring them along. And sometimes the best way to bring along groups of countries is if they work on a regional basis, as we know, and we did that in the Ottawa process. And then you've got to have your strategy for the haters, right? Or the spoilers is a nicer word to call them. And perhaps the haters are the big, problematic countries who are involved for us in the production of anti-personnel landmines, like China, Russia, the United States. But it's really the spoilers who hide behind them who you have to look out for. And for us, that was, countries who were on the fence throughout much of the process, such as the Australias and the Japans and others. And at some point, they've got to get off that fence and they've got to take an independent foreign policy decision. And that's where the national campaigning is so absolutely critical. So not just trying to do everything at the United Nations through the global coalition, but ensuring strong national pressure back home in capitals to help flip. And you're not going to flip an official. They're just going to do what they're told to by their boss. So you've got to go right to the top and be appealing for the political leadership. And so we were appealing to foreign ministers and to prime ministers ultimately to take the leadership decision on this, to take that bold leadership. And many times we would hear about, very fiery cabinet meetings where the prime minister or the president is trying to take advice from the Ministry of Defense, who will say we need every weapon at our disposal, and then from the foreign ministry, who say, well, this is actually this really important initiative happening at the moment, and we could be missing out on it if we don't participate in it. So that's one strategy for them, to make it an unmissable thing. But also to have clear rules about how they do participate so that they cannot spoil the treaty outcome. And we should probably talk about that too on this call, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I think that does popcorn nicely to Jill and your work as in the political context. And I just wanted to maybe also ask if you can build on the experience of having to negotiate this outside of the UN. As I understand, the Ottawa process started there, but didn't really get its feet until it was outside. Can you speak about that, and also touching on what Mary answered?
Yes, absolutely. And I noticed there are a few really great questions in the chat there too, Gemma, so I don't know if you're going to bring us back to those. Yeah, let's talk about sort of negotiating something inside or outside of the UN. And it sort of brings me to a variation on a theme of the importance of building the communities. Mary talked about it. She talked about, working regionally. And I want to make a really important point here. And that is that even if you want a global treaty, you need to sort of think globally and act regionally, act locally. And I spent a lot of time at the Organization of American States, African Union, Commonwealth, Francophonie, using regional organizations, because this was a security discussion and a human rights and a human security discussion. And countries needed to feel comfortable in their neighborhood with the decisions that they were taking. And I think that applies also to the work that you're doing, because these are about economic transitions and it's about climate change. It's so things that happen in a regional environment. So I would really make a pitch to you to think regionally and about those regional organizations. But at the end of the day, of course, what you want is you want a global process, because you want that universality. And again, I would say that you can get the universality in a few ways, and they are not mutually exclusive. You can get universality through a treaty, which is extremely important, but you can also get universality through a new normative approach to the issue that you're talking about. And so the process is almost as important as the outcome. If what you are trying to do is to change human behavior at the level of governments, at the level of industry, at the level of individuals. And so those processes should not be, I'm not dismissive of process. Process as an outcome if you use it in a really, really smart way, which is what we did with the civil society organizations on landmines. We worked with the ICBL, who knew that the process of building awareness, of providing facts to people, of introducing them to different arguments about the weapon system. That was all part of the outcome, right? And I think that's extremely important. But if you actually want to get a treaty done, this treaty had been the issue of landmines, or what they were called, was certain conventional weapons. And I won't go into the inside baseball intricacies of this, but certain types of conventional weapons had been negotiated at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva for many, many, many years. The Conference on Disarmament in Geneva works by consensus, which meant that anybody could veto, and a lot of people, as Mary said, could just hide behind others because they were going to do the vetoing for them. So we weren't going to get there from here, right? You were not going to get to a highest common value text in a consensus setting where you had the Chinas and the Russias and others sitting around the table who simply weren't interested. They would sign up to something at the end of the day, but it would be so watered down that it would be meaningless. So you also have to make that calculation, I think. And in our case, we knew from the outset, again, because of a lot of good work that had already been done by ICBL and others and Human Rights Watch, we knew what the basic tenets and principles were that we wanted to address in a total ban treaty on landmines. And so I would really recommend trying to write your treaty ahead of time. That's what we did on landmines. We had it in our back pocket. We basically got everybody to negotiate on the basis of a treaty that we'd already established. But at some point, and in fact, it was sort of after a meeting at the Conference on Disarmament, where it was clear we were not going to get the result we wanted, that Canada actually at the table said, look, let's just get together in Ottawa and let's have a chat about how we get to a global ban. And a lot of countries like Belgium and others who had already taken really forward-leaning action said, great idea. So we got together, in Ottawa a few months after the unsuccessful end of that UN discussion. And we sat down and we devised a strategy. And I want to say that there was absolute equality of participation and agency at the table from the outset between civil society and governments. Okay, that was a characteristic of the Ottawa process. And we decided that we were not going to be able to do it in the UN. And that was when actually, Canada, with the support, we'd had some back chats with the Secretary General of the United Nations, with the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Canada said, look, let's just negotiate this outside of the UN system. It will be a like-minded effort. Anybody who signs up to these basic principles is welcome at the table. Those of you that don't go along with the basic principles can come as an observer, and they all did, but you're not going to have a voice in the final text. And that's what we did. We just decided to take it outside the UN system. Now, it was a precipitous act, but it wasn't as perilous as you might think, because we did have a lot of support and a lot of momentum. We didn't actually know at the time if we'd get the treaty within a year, but my foreign minister told me we would. So I said, sure, I'm good with that. I'll stop there.
That's so interesting, Jill. Thank you so much for sharing that. What you said around the Ottawa process, as someone who works in the multilateral space, particularly for governments, the equality that you describe of having equal voices between civil society and governments, so long as they signed up to the basic principles, tenets, that I think is something that's really important. And you were speaking about the universality either through participation and eventual ratification, or through the creation of a new norm. Mary, can you speak about maybe your experience in that? Like the process was taken out of the UN. What was the reaction from civil society, and what especially around, I think, the question of understanding that the process is important and the value of the process itself as an outcome. How did civil society perceive that?
Okay. I want to just emphasize the importance of the bold political leadership here. I was standing at the back of the room at the end of that conference in Ottawa where, Canada invited everybody else to come. And I had two press releases in my hand. One of the press releases and the copies of it was saying, this was a great meeting. We need to now, we need to do our utmost now to work towards the goal of a treaty. The other one was, thank you, Lloyd Axworthy, for your bold leadership and for inviting countries to come back to Ottawa in December 1997 to sign the treaty banning anti-personnel landmines. We commit to do everything we can to support you in this process, and we are with you in this. And so that was out. And so I threw the first one in the bin because that was what the foreign minister said, to the shock of some of the countries, but not all of them in the room. But that was the bold political decision that was taken then, was to lead the process and to show that treaties do not have to be negotiated at the Palais des Nations in Geneva or in New York. They can be done in the capitals of the countries who care about this. And that was the launch of the Ottawa process, which was basically a series of meetings to build support for the goal of negotiating a treaty with a text that was closely held by the Canadians as the lead government in cooperation with that core group who kind of held that text and managed to complete the process at the negotiations in Oslo on the 18th of September when the text was adopted, and then of course opened for signature in December, a couple of months later. And so our role in that process was to speak with one voice as best we could, so that if there was a kind of a coordinating call with Canada, with the others involved in this, that it wasn't 50 people on there from the civil society side, but one person. Our other job was to be as organized as possible in the elements that we saw as being necessary for the treaty. And that meant, again, having a lot of internal debates about how strict the prohibitions should be, how extensive the humanitarian provisions should be, how to ensure that we attained the strongest possible standard. Because there's two kind of treaties that you can get. One is a universal treaty with everybody on board at the moment, at the outset, but that is highly likely to be a weak agreement. And sometimes the promise is that, well, we'll improve it over time. But I know of very few treaties that have been reopened after they've been adopted and improved over time. What we achieved with the Ottawa Treaty was an extremely high standard, a very clear treaty, a very strict prohibition. And that was not something that some countries were able to sign up to at the outset. 121 or 22 signed in Ottawa, and now we're up to 165 today, 27 years later. And that's because we wore them down and we managed to convince so many to come on board in that period afterwards, and then also to change the behavior of the countries who didn't sign. But I think Jill would be good here to kind of describe how you kept the government support united behind that goal as you went through that tricky period between the launch of the process and the actual signature in Ottawa in December a year later.
Thank you so much, Mary. And also thank you for popcorning over to Jill. Jill, while you think about that question as well, we've got a couple in the chat about that really delve deeper into the relationship between the civil society movements and governments. I think that there's something really important to hear from you here on how you work with the governments, especially with the core group. At what level of government did you work? And, this relationship between the civil society movement and Canada, who really championed the process. I think it'd be really good to get your honest reactions about the pros and, kind of the challenges of working in that space.
Well, thanks. Yeah, one risks making everything sound too easy and, without any challenges. Of course, it was very difficult, but I have to tell you that we had absolute unity of purpose between the civil society organizations and the governments that were committed to this issue. So we didn't have to fight with what's the nature of what we want. We actually had that coming together very, very quickly. And we did that by having a principles document early on. And the Belgian government played a role at this early on. So you actually were working with like-minded countries. And I think we can come back to a discussion about this, what happens to those who are excluded? Because in your setting of fossil fuels, it's very different. Every person that fills up a gas tank or whatever has an interest in this, right? Or works some, it's a bit of a different dynamic. But so I say our starting point was that we had really a unity of effort here. But I can tell you that this was 365, 24/7. across time zones of coordination, of choreography, of consultation. I had a person on my team whose sole role was to interact on a moment-by-moment basis with civil society. Bob Lawson, who Mary knows extremely well, and who he was as much a part of the civil society community as he was of government. And so I dual-hatted him in that way. That was his role. It wasn't to be a liaison, it was to be an intersection, okay? And it wasn't about consulting with, it was doing it by design from the outset, finding out, getting the input from civil society and those who were the stakeholders into the government process. It didn't mean that we could always go with everything that came to us. That wasn't the case, and Mary, knows that. There were tough negotiations because government have different interests and different responsibilities and accountabilities. But it was a very, very deliberately designed process where civil society was part of the process from the outset. It's a little bit, if any of you have worked on the Arctic at all, it's a little bit that the concept that is behind the Arctic Council, where Indigenous communities are participating communities, right? But it was taken to even a greater extent here. But I think it's a very interesting model. What level of government? Every level of government. So not only did I have a foreign minister who was extraordinary and prescient, but we had a prime minister who at the outset had backed this because he knew it was going to be risky because we were running right up against the United States, which is not something that one does lightly at any moment in time. But the prime minister said, yes, I'm all in on this. So our engagements with government and my personal engagements were from the level of heads of state and head of government to ministers, to chiefs of defense staff. Don't forget, we had other communities there we had to bring along. So we had to bring along the military. In your case, you have heads of industry, you have all sorts of, you have workers' unions, you have all sorts of things. But it was the military, it was foreign ministers, it was the legal bodies of the foreign ministries and of the justice departments in countries. And then it was my working level directors of arms control divisions or whoever happened to be my counterpart globally. But it was absolutely every level of government. So the coordination that I had to do was massively vertical in my own system. And then it was absolutely universally around the world, horizontal. And I did that and was able to do this only because I worked with this extraordinary group of countries who were all doing exactly the same thing as me. So we were replicas of each other around the world. And those who were members of the EU, for example, were doing this within the EU setting, or those who were members of the, the Association of American States were kind of doing it there. And then, of course, civil society was working this out across the media, across broader society. So it was an absolutely deliberately, meticulously choreographed year-long effort to get the treaty.
That sounds like incredibly exciting, but also incredibly exhausting. And I'm like, these are the realities, right, of this type of work. Something I really would like to lean into with both of you is that the issue of fossil fuels comes from a colonialist, extractivist mindset. Can you talk more about how you worked with particularly developing countries and smaller countries with less power in this process? We've heard it a lot that the UN is an equalizer, one country, one vote. Taking it out of the UN, I think, as you acknowledged, was risky, but you were able to form this kind of very equitable format. Can you tell us what your developing country counterparts, how they really seized the process? What was their role? How did you ensure that their voices were always being heard?
Mary, do you want to start and I'll pile on? Or?
Sure. I mean, I put in a fast negotiation is a good negotiation. By that, I mean, within, launching negotiations and adopting your treaty within a year to 18 months at the most, because if it takes any longer than that, you can lose sight of the original goal. More importantly, you can lose your champions. Activists, we're activists forever, but diplomats tend to have to move on after every 4 years foreign ministers are re-elected, secretary generals, their terms expire, the Pope dies, all this stuff happens. So getting all of those things aligned is such a big piece of work. It can feel like that part takes forever. But if they're all aligned, and if you've got your policy coherence and your elements ready, you can get it over the line. I was just looking for a report that we did on killer robots and agenda for action, and this has got what we see as some of the necessary ingredients, learning from the Ottawa process and other ones, for a fair and productive negotiation that results in a strong international standard. And so to kind of keep the champion states and the global majority that you want on board, it's critical to have the communications going and to have the leads. So in a way, a core group has to have the kind of regional leads within it, right, who can help with that. But the reason I'm talking about this is that you need to look at how the decisions are going to be taken during the negotiations. And if you try and negotiate by consensus, you will not get a strong international standard. And how do you do that? You do that by setting the rules of the game. And so the Ottawa process was negotiated under the threat of going to a vote. And a majority of the states who were participating would have to agree before amendments could be made to the draft text that was on the table that was held so closely by Canada and that core group of states. And this mattered, and I don't want to stray into Jill's territory here, but the United States, the other thing you want to do is make it irresistible for countries to stay away and to not participate in it. But you also want to have those ground rules absolutely clear, so that when big countries like the United States come in and say, here are all of our red lines that we're demanding be put into this agreement, they then needed to go around and do the work of trying to convince all of these global majority countries that these red lines were the way to go. They couldn't get the support for those red lines. They couldn't get to that kind of 2/3 of countries voting with them for that. So when they withdrew those proposals, it was then possible to adopt the treaty. So be very careful and wary of consensus as a mode for your negotiations.
Gemma, I'm going to build a bit on what Mary said, but I'm going to come back to your question about the role of smaller countries. And it goes back to my opening words, I think, which is if you set the issue through the right lens, then you see the stakeholders in different ways. So interestingly, in landmines, the smaller countries were the powerful countries because they were the mine-affected countries. It was the voices of the Cambodias and the Mozambiques and Nicaragua. And these are the countries, these are the voices that resonated because they lived with the result. And don't forget, we had set up the issue, not as an arms control issue. And we didn't say these are useless military weapons. We said the humanitarian cost outweighs the military benefit. That's all we're saying. And so we set that up as the starting premise. So I think it's very important to get that premise right. It is very challenging on fossil fuels. I mean, I see it even in Canada, which has a high level of sort of environmental awareness and climate change concern, but wasn't very happy when we actually had to pay for it. Okay? So this is something that touches everybody. We have an industry, that where there are a lot of people who work in the industry, who have concerns about their future. Fossil fuels touch everybody in a different way. But I think figuring out how to raise the awareness and establish a lens that lets people, including those who may be a little bit skeptical or a little bit fearful, recognize that, there's something that needs to be worked on here. And I think that's the other thing that I would like to say, and it's a bit of a lesson learned, particularly in the current context, right? I mean, when we did landmines, there was no social media, there was no internet, totally different world, like totally, right? We did this all, in real life with real people on phones and all sorts of silly things. But I think finding space for those who are fearful or questioning about an issue, helping them to understand and buy in to a new way forward to deal with the issue is extremely important. And that's, I think your non-proliferation approach is really interesting. I spent a lot of time negotiating the non-proliferation treaty, so I'm very familiar with it. But that idea, I mean, the NPT does not start by saying there's no such thing as nuclear weapons. It says, regrettably, there's something called nuclear weapons, and a bunch of you have them, and a bunch of you might want them, and we don't think that's a great idea. So let's figure out how we reduce the levels. Let's figure out how we give the benefits of that through nuclear energy or whatever. So it's a very interesting creation, and that's where I think your treaty is a very interesting kind of approach. But I think that you'll probably need to find more space for those who are skeptical, okay? Because fossil fuels have an impact on everybody's lives and everybody uses them. But I do want to just say that the agency of the smaller powers was not an issue, because those are the voices that we brought to the table when people were thinking a little bit whatever. We brought those voices to the table, or they said, we're coming to the table to tell you exactly what the impact of these things is on our lives, on our economies, on our families, on our development, on everything.
Thank you so much, Jill and Mary, for those powerful thoughts. When you're having a good time, when you're learning a lot, time does fly. I've just realized we only have 5 minutes left. I wanna give the floor to someone from like the participants, if you'd like to ask a question verbally that we can end with. But if nobody raises their hand, I might just take some moderator's privilege and say thank you, Mary and Jill. And I wanna close off with your voices. I'd like to hear from you as our final thoughts. I don't see anybody raising their hand, so I'm just going to ask for your final thoughts. We are trying to negotiate a treaty on fossil fuel non-proliferation. This is a mix of civil society and governments. It is an extremely tense political climate. You can only tell us 2 things about what we really need to know. Can I have your 2 things each? Please, your 2 pieces of key advice that you want us to go away with, that you think we need to do tomorrow in order to get this over the line. Thank you.
Gosh, I'm looking at Jill because those are such big questions. Stigmatize, stigmatize, stigmatize. I know you keep saying that. I see plastics being mentioned a lot in the chat. And I think the more you talk about single-use plastics, you know, is you know, to explain what everybody's kind of like fossil fuels, you know, but to explain exactly what it is and to stigmatize that will go a long way. And I know that you're doing that as well. And the other is that just because it's tough times doesn't mean that you don't act, you know, you find other ways to demonstrate that you're making progress, even if it's small stuff, and you celebrate those small wins as you're going towards the big win, right? The big treaty is the ultimate win. But in these tough times, we need to give people reasons to be hopeful and to be motivated. And that's very challenging at a time when the US is looking to withhold funds from the UN and all sorts of things could happen. But remember that this is a phase, this is a period, it will pass, and that you're on the right side of history here and you will get to your goal. Thanks.
Well, I feel like I get 4 things because Mary's already said 2 of them, which is terrific, which I endorse very much. But I think I would like to really make a pitch for inclusivity. And in the following way, fossil fuels are different from landmines. As I say, everybody has a stake. And my inclusivity means you need to speak to industry, you need to speak to scientists, you need to speak to the unions, you need to speak to people whose lives will be affected by these. It's a little bit like the victim perspective, but the victim can be a victim of climate change, but it can also be a victim of someone who would lose their job, right? And I think that we have to learn from the current environment how quickly things can become polarized and divisive, and no good will come of it. So I think we need to be absolutely inclusive. And my second point is just to recapitulate process as outcome. So don't give up on the process. The process is so important, and this can be iterative. And every time you get someone who says, yeah, I get it, you're succeeding. Okay, so the treaty is important. It's really, really important. But like the UN Charter, which is the most prescient, beautiful, crafted, extraordinary document determined to, save succeeding, generations from the scourge of war, it doesn't get implemented all the time. So change behavior, get a treaty, but change behavior.
Thank you so much, Jill and Mary. With those profound thoughts, I just want to offer our sincere thanks from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative to you for availing your time and sharing with us your very deep knowledge. I also want to take a moment to thank everybody on the call for making time to come and listen and really help us think through the lessons that we've learned from this treaty, but also how we move forward and how we really make a change for the world. And Mary never apologized for taking time. This was so incredibly useful and we learned so much. So without further ado, invite everybody to give a hand from wherever you are for Jill and Mary. And I think that someone will hurt me if I don't ask this. So I believe that we have to do a group photo. So if everybody can, if you're able and if you're comfortable, if you could please turn on your camera. If Zoe, our tech master, can put everybody on screen, which I don't know how it's done. Excellent. So I'd like to ask everybody to smile. And excellent. Zoe, was that good? Do we need to do another one with the second page? Or
Got
no?
it.
Thank you so much. And thank you. And it's so nice to see some of my colleagues on the call. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you so much, Gemma. Great to see you all. All the best.